All right, welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. And today we're tackling a thinker who really sits at the crossroads of philosophy and sociology. Someone whose ideas have had a huge impact on how we understand not only society, but, the big questions about knowledge and ethics and, yeah, even the nature of modern life itself, Max Weber.
Absolutely. He's one of those figures whose influence just kind of ripples out across so many disciplines. And to really get a grasp on Weber, we're going to be diving into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on him, which is like a really solid, comprehensive overview.
Perfect. So we're not just looking at his sociology in isolation.
Right.
We want to see how his philosophical ideas, about how we know things, about ethics, really shaped and informed his views on society.
Exactly. Think of it as like extracting the philosophical DNA that runs through all of his work. And this is especially relevant, I think, for anyone, coming from a philosophical background. Because Weber, even though he's known as a sociologist, he was grappling with some seriously deep philosophical problems.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, he was writing at a pretty pivotal time, right? A late 19th, early 20th century. This is a period where, like, the whole intellectual landscape is shifting. Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, all these figures are shaking things up.
Totally. This is a time of, intense intellectual ferment. Like the aftershocks of the Enlightenment are still being felt, and Weber is right there in the thick of it, trying to make sense of it all. And you see this even in his early career, starting out as a lawyer, then moving into political economy. And he's really immersed in these debates about the proper methods for studying, well, anything really, but especially the social world.
Right. So there's this famous debate. He gets caught up in the Methodist strike.
Yeah.
Like, what was the core of that disagreement? It sounds pretty wonky.
Yeah, well, it was about, how you approach knowledge. It was basically a clash between two schools of thought, one emphasizing like abstract universal theories, and the other stressing the importance of detailed historical analysis.
So, like, big picture versus nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, kind of. Karl Menger was a champion of the abstract theoretical approach, whereas Gustav Schmoller, who is actually one of Weber's mentors, was all about the historical details.
Interesting. So Weber's kind of getting pulled in both directions here. But it sounds like there's a specific group of philosophers and neo-Kantians who really provide him with, like, a key framework for thinking about knowledge. So what was it about the neo-Kantians that really grabbed his attention?
Well, they were like wrestling with some fundamental questions about how we know anything at all, right? And a lot of this goes back to Kant himself, the whole idea that there's a difference between reality as it exists out there and how we as thinking subjects experience and understand it. They were really pushing back against the Hegelian idea that reality is somehow a product of our concepts, or like that history has this inherent meaning or direction.
So it's not that our concepts, like, create reality, but they're how we make sense of it.
Exactly. And they saw this process of concept formation as being fundamentally rational. Like for Herman Cohen, who was a big influence, the act of thinking itself has to follow logical principles. So the only reality we can really know is the one that's accessible to us through reason.
Okay, so that's a pretty big shift, moving away from, like, metaphysical speculation about the nature of reality to focusing on the conditions of knowledge itself. And this is where Weber's coming from, too.
Exactly. And this emphasis on like the role of rational concepts, it led the neo-Kantians to make a key distinction between the natural sciences and the cultural or historical sciences.
So how we study physics is different from how we study history.
Right. Windelband, for example, he argued that the natural sciences are all about finding general laws, what he called a nomothetic approach. But the cultural historical sciences, they're more interested in the unique, in particular, the value-laden aspects of human events and actions, an ideographic approach.
So, like, in physics, you're looking for the laws of gravity that apply everywhere. But in history, you're trying to understand, I don't know, like, the specific causes of the French Revolution.
Exactly. And this raises a huge methodological challenge because if values are subjective and tied to specific people or cultures, how do you study them in a way that's, objective and rigorous?
Right, because science is supposed to be about, objectivity. So how do you reconcile that with this focus on subjective values?
Yeah, that was the big puzzle. And this is where Rickert's idea of value relation, or Verbeziehung, comes in. Basically, he said that even though we choose what to study in history based on our own values, what he called value relevance, we can still be objective by being clear about the distinctions between, say, our values as researchers and the values of the historical actors we're studying.
Okay, so you have to be aware of your own biases, but that doesn't mean you can't be objective in your analysis.
Right. But even Rickert, he kind of struggled with this. He made some assumptions about, like, there being universally valid values within a culture that, a truly objective historian could identify. And this started to sound a bit like, well, maybe he's sneaking some metaphysics back in.
Yeah, so it seems like even the neo-Kantians couldn't fully escape this tension between subjective values and objective knowledge.
Exactly. And this is the intellectual context where Weber comes in. He's deeply influenced by these debates, but he's going to take them in some really interesting directions.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about Weber's ethical views.
Hmm.
And I mean, it's fascinating how he's influenced by both Kant and Nietzsche, right? Like two very different takes on morality.
Right. Talk about a philosophical balancing act. Weber was drawn to the rigor and the emphasis on principled action in Kant's ethics. He saw it as being about self-discipline, about achieving genuine freedom through the internalization of a rationally derived moral law.
So it's not about just doing whatever you want, but about acting based on principles you've thought through for yourself.
Yeah, and this is a big contrast with, like, utilitarianism, which Kant saw as basically just a sophisticated form of egoism. For Kant, it's about the will, the rational will, not
Yeah.
just having free choice or Willkür.
So there's this inward turn in Kant. It's about finding the universal moral law within yourself.
Exactly. And interestingly, Weber's reading of Kant was also influenced by these debates within Protestant theology, which were happening in Germany at the time.
So there's this connection between Kant's ethics and the Protestant emphasis on like individual conscience and self-examination.
Yeah, absolutely. But even though Weber was deeply influenced by Kant, he also felt that Kant's whole framework was kind of coming apart in the modern world.
And that's where Nietzsche comes in, right? He's the one who throws the wrench in the works.
Well, yeah, I mean, Nietzsche is like the ultimate skeptic. He's questioning the whole Enlightenment project, the idea that reason and knowledge will lead to progress. For him, the relentless pursuit of truth can actually lead to nihilism, to this sense that nothing really matters.
So Weber's kind of caught between these two poles, right? On the one hand, this Kantian ideal of rational, principled action. And on the other hand, Nietzsche's critique of the whole idea of objective truth and morality.
Yeah, and Weber's trying to find a way to navigate this tension, to figure out how to act meaningfully in a world where those old certainties have been shaken.
So it's like, how do you live ethically in a world where God is dead, as Nietzsche famously put it?
Exactly. And this leads to what some scholars have called Weber's tragic worldview. He sees the heroic individual striving to act ethically in a world where the ground is constantly shifting beneath their feet.
So there's a sense of like nobility in that struggle, even if there's no guarantee of success.
Absolutely. It's this ethic of, like, nevertheless, you keep striving, you keep making choices, even though you know there's no ultimate foundation.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of philosophical influences. Now let's dive into Weber's big idea, rationalization. And the text suggests that this concept is, in a way, his response to these philosophical dilemmas we've been talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Rationalization isn't just some sociological observation for Weber. It's how he grapples with these big questions about knowledge, ethics, even the fate of humanity in the modern world. And while there's some debate about whether this is like the one unifying theme in his work, it definitely runs through everything he did.
Yeah, and I mean, it's hard to miss, right? It's got this like almost inescapable quality, especially with that image of the iron cage.
Right. And sometimes he makes these pronouncements about the unique trajectory of the West, especially in his writings on the sociology of religion. And that can make it sound like, well, is this just a Western thing? Is it inevitable?
Yeah, like, is he saying that rationalization is just how history unfolds?
Yeah, that's a common misreading. But Weber was very clear that he didn't believe in, like, a universal law of history. He actually rejected that kind of grand narrative. What he was trying to do was understand the specific conditions that led to the particular form of rationalization we see in the West.
So it's not like a blueprint that every society has to follow.
No, not at all. It's more about understanding the dynamics of this process, how it plays out differently in different contexts.
Okay, so if it's not some iron law of history, then what is it? How does Weber actually define rationalization?
It's basically this drive towards making the world calculable, predictable, controllable. Everything gets systematized, organized, measured and optimized. And you see this in so many aspects of modern life, like obviously in capitalism with its focus on efficiency and profit maximization, but also in law, administration, even science itself.
So like everything becomes subject to this logic of efficiency and control.
Yeah, and that can be really powerful, right? I mean, think about all the advances we've made because of it, but it also comes with a cost.
Right. So what are some of the downsides of this relentless rationalization? The text talks about like this growing impersonality in social relations and an increased emphasis on control, right?
Yeah, for Weber, rationalization goes hand in hand with objectification. People become like cogs in the machine. You're evaluated based on your output, your efficiency, not your individual qualities. And this happens not just in like factories, but in bureaucracies and legal systems everywhere.
So it's not just about economics, it's about how we relate to each other, how we see ourselves.
Exactly. And he even connects this to the Protestant ethic, which is kind of paradoxical, right? Because Protestantism is all about this intense individual relationship with God. But it also created this emphasis on worldly achievement, on proving your faith through your actions. And this, for Weber, contributed to this growing objectification of the self.
So our sense of individuality might actually be a product of this process of rationalization in a way.
Yeah, it's a really thought-provoking idea. And then there's the issue of control. I mean, clearly, science and technology have given us incredible power over the natural world. But for Weber, this control also extends to human behavior. We create these institutions, these systems of discipline and surveillance that shape how we act, how we think.
Yeah, the panopticon comes to mind, right? Like this idea that we're always being watched, even if we can't see the watcher.
Exactly. And so the modern individual, even though they might have certain freedoms, they're also enmeshed in these increasingly complex webs of control.
So it's not all sunshine and roses, right? This process of rationalization, it creates these dilemmas, these paradoxes. And this is where we get to the iron cage and the fragmentation of values.
Right. The iron cage is like this powerful image of how we can become trapped by our own creations, you know? These rationalized systems that were supposed to make life better can end up stifling our creativity, our sense of meaning. And then there's this problem of value fragmentation.
So what does he mean by that?
It's like as the world becomes disenchanted, as science and technology take over, the old unifying worldviews, whether they were religious or philosophical, start to break down.
So we lose this sense of like a shared moral compass.
Yeah, and in their place, we get this like polytheism of values. Different spheres of life, art, science, politics, religion, they all develop their own internal logic, their own set of values. And these can be completely at odds with each other.
So it's like what's considered good in one sphere might be seen as bad in another.
Exactly. And this creates this constant tension, this struggle to figure out how to live in a world where there's no one right answer, no overarching set of principles.
So it's like the gods and demons are battling it out, but inside our own heads. Or
Yeah, in a way. It's a kind of reenchantment, but not in a good way. And this connects back to Weber's concern about the fate of the modern individual, what he called Menshentum. He worried that this fragmentation of values, combined with the increasing rationalization of society, would ultimately lead to a loss of freedom and a sense of meaning.
So the very things that were supposed to liberate us, like science and technology, might actually be undermining our ability to live meaningful lives.
Right. And so the big question for Weber becomes, like, how do we salvage individual freedom in this context? How do we make choices? How do we act ethically when the world is so complex, so fragmented?
Yeah, and this brings us to his methodology, right? Because it's not just about studying society, it's about how to do so responsibly, ethically.
Absolutely. For Weber, methodology wasn't just some dry technical exercise. It was deeply intertwined with his ethical and political concerns, like how do we produce knowledge about the social world in a way that's both rigorous and sensitive to these fundamental dilemmas of modernity?
So it's not just about getting the facts right, but about the values that inform our research, our interpretations.
Exactly. And this leads to one of his key concepts, Verstehen, which is usually translated as interpretive understanding.
Okay, so what's that all about?
It starts with the idea that social science is different from natural science. In the natural sciences, you're studying things, objects. But in social science, you're studying actions, human actions. And actions are always imbued with meaning, with intentions, with values.
So it's not just about observing what people do, but understanding why they do it, what it means to them.
Exactly. And that's what Verstehen's all about. Trying to grasp the subjective meaning that actors attach to their actions. It's like putting yourself in their shoes, trying to see the world from their perspective.
But isn't that like super subjective? How do you make sure your own biases aren't creeping in?
Yeah, that's the challenge. And Weber was very clear that Verstehen has to be more than just like empathy or intuition. It has to be grounded in evidence. You have to be able to connect the meanings you're imputing to the actor's actual behavior, their choices, the context they're operating in. But here's where Weber parts ways with Rickert.
Oh, how so?
Well, Rickert thought that you could find like these objective transhistorical criteria for judging the ends of human action. But Weber was more skeptical. He said, look, ultimately, those ultimate ends, those values, they're subjective. And the researcher's own values are always going to play a role in what they choose to study, what they consider important.
So there's no escaping your own perspective, even if you're trying to be objective.
Right. But that doesn't mean that all knowledge is just relative. It means that you have to be really rigorous about separating your own values from the process of empirical analysis, from how you present your findings. And this is where Wertfreiheit comes in, which is often translated as value freedom.
So it's not that you have to be completely value-free, but that you have to be transparent about your values.
Exactly. You have to acknowledge them. You have to be aware of how they might be shaping your research. And this is both a methodological principle and, an ethical imperative for Weber. It's about intellectual honesty.
Okay, so we've got Verstehen, we've got Wertfreiheit, and then there's this other big methodological tool, the ideal type. Like, what's a purpose of that?
So the ideal type, it's not meant to be like a perfect representation of reality. It's a kind of conceptual tool that you construct to help you understand complex social phenomena. It's like you take certain aspects of something and you exaggerate them, you accentuate them to create this simplified, idealized model.
So it's like a caricature almost.
Yeah, kind of. It helps you see the underlying logic of something, even if it doesn't fully capture all the messy details. And importantly for Weber, the ideal type forces you to be explicit about the values that are shaping your analysis, because you're consciously choosing which aspects to emphasize, which viewpoints to highlight.
So it's another way of being self-reflective about your own biases.
Exactly. And all of this, the Verstand, the Wertfreiheit, the ideal type, it's all part of what Weber saw as the ethical responsibility of the social scientist. It's about being rigorous, being honest, being clear-sighted.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here: epistemology, ethics, methodology. Well, let's wrap things up by talking about Weber's political views. And one thing that stands out is his concern with, like, character, with cultivating certain traits in individuals, especially in leaders.
Yeah, and this gets to the heart of his political project. I mean, Weber was a liberal, but a very particular kind of liberal. He was deeply committed to individual freedom, but he also saw how, like, the modern bureaucratic state, with its emphasis on efficiency and control, could actually threaten that freedom.
Yeah, that tension between individual liberty and the power of the state is like a classic theme in political thought.
Absolutely. And for Weber, the question was, how do you balance these competing forces? How do you create a system that's both efficient and just, that allows for individual flourishing?
And this is where his definition of the state comes in, right? Like that famous line about the state having a monopoly on the legitimate use of physical force.
Right. It sounds kind of brutal, right? But
Yeah.
the key word there is legitimate. For Weber, it wasn't enough for the state to just have power. It had to have authority, which means that people have to see its power as justified as, right?
So it's not just about coercion. It's about the reasons people give for obeying the law, for respecting the state's authority.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this gets to his three ideal types of domination: charismatic, traditional, and legal rational. These are different ways that authority gets legitimized and maintained.
So like charisma is about the personal qualities of the leader. Tradition is about, well, tradition. And legal rational is about, I guess, following the rules.
Yeah, exactly. And Weber was particularly concerned about the rise of legal rational domination because it tends to lead to bureaucratization, to this impersonal system where everything is governed by rules and procedures.
So it's like efficiency taken to the extreme.
Right. And this can be really effective, but it can also lead to a kind of dehumanization, a loss of individual freedom and creativity.
And this brings us to, I think, one of the most controversial aspects of Weber's political thought, his idea of leadership democracy, or Führerdemokratie.
Yeah, this is the part that gets people really riled up because it sounds like, well, isn't he just advocating for, like, a strongman leader? Isn't this a recipe for authoritarianism?
Right, because he's saying we need these charismatic leaders to guide us
Yeah.
to make the tough decisions.
Right. But it's more nuanced than that. Weber was really worried about the dangers of mass democracy, the idea that the majority can just trample over individual rights. And he also saw how bureaucratic structures could become like self-perpetuating, how they could stifle innovation and dynamism.
So he saw these charismatic leaders as a way to counterbalance those forces.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that for Weber, genuine charisma always involves responsibility. The leader isn't just some dictator, they're accountable to their followers. And he also emphasized the importance of civil society, of these spaces where people can come together, debate, organize and cultivate those leadership qualities.
So it's not just about the great man at the top, but about the vitality of democratic institutions and civic engagement,
Exactly. And this connects to his distinction between the ethics of conviction and the ethics of responsibility.
which sounds like a real head-scratcher. Like, what's the difference there?
So, the ethic of conviction, it's about sticking to your principles no matter what. It's about the purity of your intentions. But the ethic of responsibility, it's about thinking about the consequences of your actions, about the real world impact of your decisions.
So it's like one is about idealism and the other is about pragmatism.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
And for Weber, the true politician, the one who has a real vocation for politics, has to be able to balance both of these. They have to be passionate about their beliefs, but also willing to make compromises, to think about the long-term effects of their choices.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between idealism and realism.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Weber's concern with character. He wanted to cultivate this, like total personality, someone who's both deeply committed to their values and also capable of acting effectively in the world, of taking responsibility for the consequences of their actions.
So it's not just about what you believe. It's about how you act, how you navigate the complexities of the political realm.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of Weber's most enduring legacies. His focus on the ethical dimension of politics, on the need for leaders who are both visionary and responsible, who can inspire us without losing sight of the practical realities.
Well, this has been a truly whirlwind tour of Max Weber's thought. We've covered everything from epistemology to ethics to politics. And for you, our philosophically inclined listener, I think there's so much here to chew on.
Yeah, I mean, Weber's work is still incredibly relevant today. He helps us understand the challenges of living in a modern world, this tension between individual freedom and bureaucratic control, the fragmentation of values, the dilemmas of ethical action in a world where there's no easy answers.
So as we close out this deep dive, here's a question for you to ponder. What can we learn from Weber's tragic but ultimately hopeful vision of the modern individual? How can we cultivate those qualities of responsibility, of clear-sightedness, of ethical commitment in a world that often seems to be spinning out of control? It's a question worth wrestling with, even if there's no easy solution. So until next time, keep thinking deeply, and we'll see you back here for another deep dive.